welcome to today's Alzheimer's live chat. I just want to thank you for hanging with us. We had a few little technical glitches, but I think we have them all worked out as of now. So officially want to welcome you to today's live chat. My name is Lakelyn Hogan. I'm gerontologist and caregiver advocate with Home Instead Senior Care. I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today for the Alzheimer's live chat. Our live chats are brought to you by Home Instead Senior Care, a network of locally owned franchise offices. Home Instead Senior Care's network offers in-home care with an individualized approach to keeping your loved one safe and independent at home. To learn more, you can visit homeinstead.com. And before we jump into today's live chat, I did want to go over some housekeeping items. We did mute all of your lines to reduce any background noise, so feel free to still move about your house. If you need to do the dishes or fold some laundry, we won't hear any of that in the background. If the dog comes in barking, have no fear, your lines are muted. But if you have a question, we definitely want to hear from you, and there is a place to type in a question there on your screen. You can send in a question at any time, and as you think of them, as we go throughout the chat, if a question comes to mind, please send those questions in. Don't be shy. Our experts are happy to answer them for you. And your questions will also likely help other listeners that we have on the line. And then you don't have to take notes. Don't worry about taking any notes because we do record this webinar and then we post it the following day and we send it back out in an email format. So you can re-listen to parts that you wanted to hear again, maybe share it with a family member, friend, colleague, so that they can get this great information as well. So those are kind of just some high-level housekeeping items there for you. So let's jump right into today's topic, younger onset dementia. And since I started these live chats, I joined in 2016 at the start of the year. We focused the majority of them on caring for an individual who has Alzheimer's or another type of dementia diagnosis. The topics have centered around caregiver support and resources for the family caregiver. However, we have yet to hear from an individual living with the disease. So today I'm excited. We're so fortunate to have an expert on our live chat that is very open and honest about his diagnosis, and he's going to share with us what it's like to live with Alzheimer's. Michael Ellenbogen was diagnosed with younger onset Alzheimer's disease at the age of 49. Prior to his diagnosis, he was a network operations manager for a Fortune 500 financial institution. Difficulty with work-related tasks eventually led to his early retirement. As a world-renowned international dementia advocate and connector, he has been featured in nationally syndicated TV, radio, and other media outlets. He has written for blogs, newspapers, journals, and websites, and has shared his personal perspective as a guest speaker. Michael currently serves on the Pennsylvania Alzheimer's Disease Planning Committee and other advisory councils. He is a regular speaker at the Advisory Council on Alzheimer's Research, Care, and Services, and has been featured in the Alzheimer's Disease International's 2012 World Alzheimer's Report. He's also represented the U.S. and the world for people living with dementia at the World Health Organization. He's interested in motivating those with Alzheimer's to raise their voice and reduce the stigma around the disease. He believes that a diagnosis with Alzheimer's disease is not the end for him because he has so much more to give the world. Michael wrote about his journey with the disease in his latest book titled From the Corner Office to Alzheimer's. So Michael, I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for all of the advocacy work that you do. I'm excited for our listeners to hear about your story, to hear about your personal experience with Alzheimer's disease. So welcome, Michael.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon, everyone.
Michael, I thought maybe we could start out by having you just give us a little bit of a background on when you received the diagnosis. We had somebody write in, Melly. She said, when did you receive the diagnosis and how did you share that news with everyone in your life? So would you mind starting on that question?
Sure. Well, for me, it was really a long road. It actually started at age 39 that I started experiencing some kind of difficulties related to my cognitive skills. I was having problems such as remembering extension numbers, 4-digit extension numbers. I started having difficulty remembering my employees' names, first names, and acronyms related to my field. So at that point in time, I actually went and saw many doctors, but after spending 3-4 years, they all came back and indicated that they thought I was stressed or depressed. So it was very frustrating. It wasn't until age 49, about I guess 6 months to a year before that, that I was finally able to receive a diagnosis. And that's only because I started out with new doctors, and the new doctors, I never made them aware about the old doctors. I thought it was good to start out with a good, clean slate, because one thing I learned was once you tell a doctor about your previous medical history, they all seem to just focus on that. They don't make up their own decisions. So I was finding that to become a problem. So this time I started with all new doctors, and one of the psychiatrists that I was seeing, because I saw all kinds of doctors all at the same time, came back and after spending some time with them, indicated to my wife, who's a medical person, that did she ever think of Alzheimer's? And my wife's in the medical field, and she said, no, I never thought of somebody, so young being able to have that. So as I progressed and went through all the different testing, well, I had received for my neurologist a diagnosis back from my MRI, which indicated I didn't have any problems. So my wife at that point in time was the one who suggested to the doctor that he think that I could get a PET scan, because my wife had done research and PET scans were a good possible way of identifying having Alzheimer's. So he agreed to doing that. And once I got the PET scan, that was able to determine that it was conclusive of having Alzheimer's. And that's when everything changed in my life. And all of a sudden, all the doctors now were starting to make their decisions based on that. And I was really fortunate because my wife was a medical person, and she was able to go and do the research on her own and try to figure out what she saw. And as she was doing the research, she was able to verify that a lot of the symptoms I was explaining and seeing, and that she was also seeing, that they correlated to having Alzheimer's.
Wow, so it sounds like your wife was pretty involved in the whole process of you getting a diagnosis. Which is fantastic. It seems like she was a good advocate for you through that entire process. So did you end up telling other members of your family? And if so, what was their reaction, or how did you go about that process of telling people?
Well, I remember not telling my daughter for the longest time. My daughter actually had lived at that time in South Carolina, and I really didn't want to tell her over the phone. So we actually waited for a time that she actually came here to visit with us. And that's when I finally told her. I think when we told a lot of people, especially my family, my sister, my mother, people were more in denial about it. They were just saying, oh, you don't have that, or, you don't seem to have any issues. And it really took, believe it or not, a lot of time before people really started believing it. In fact, I think it was probably years before my mother finally accepted it, and my sister, and that was only after I had written my book, because they got an opportunity to read my book, and they said, wow, we didn't realize you had all these problems. And it was only because of my book that they came back and then they told me, we're so sorry. We just didn't realize that you were having all these issues. So I just wonder, if I never had that, would they even still believe me at this time?
Wow. Yeah. Well, and I wonder, I guess from your experience, so remind me again, you got diagnosed at age 49. So how long have you have been living with a diagnosis now? How many years
I
has
am
it been?
now 59 years old. So you'll have to do the math because I can't
Yeah.
figure those things out anymore.
About 10 years
But
it seems like, yeah.
yes, I have to tell you, I'm very fortunate. I am beating the odds when it comes to this disease. You know, most people have an 8 to 9, 10-year lifespan, and I'm now really going over 20 years since I've had this. So I consider myself very lucky.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and we actually had a question just come in that relates well to that. Donna wrote in and she said that she is a member of a global caregiver network, and she says that the loved ones she works with are losing their capacity to write and speak meaningfully within just a few years of a diagnosis. So, what do you, Michael, attribute to your continued high functioning? So it seems like you've been living with the disease for 10 plus years now, and how are you? Are there things that you're doing to, engage your mind and keep your cognition sharp, or can you speak to that a little bit? How do you think that you are beating the odds?
Well, first of all, we are all different who are living with this disease. None of us are the same, and some of us tend to progress much slower, and some of us progress much, much, much quicker. So keep that in mind. I cannot tell you for sure why mine is being delayed, but I will tell you it definitely has, I believe, a lot to do with your mindset, thinking positively, by keeping your mind constantly engaged. I tend to deal with a lot of high level people all the time, speak to people. So I'm trying to stay at the top of my game all the time, even though I may not be that person anymore. I also do exercise, and at the same time, I take various drugs. Whether they're helping or not, I do not know. But I can tell you I'm doing things that most people don't do. Besides the normal Alzheimer's disease drugs that I take, I've also ended up taking drugs because I had a heart attack. So I take things that will actually lower my heart rate, keep my blood pressure low. These are all things that they discuss that could be potential to having an increase in Alzheimer's or quicker. Plus, I take a lot of things like resveratrol, turmeric, coconut oil. Do they help? I don't know. Is it the possibility that they might also somehow be helping? I think it's possible, but I'm not the type of person that would say it without the science. So I think just having that great attitude is probably what makes probably the biggest difference, and having something meaningful to do. I think that's probably one of the key things when it comes to this disease is so many of us give up or write ourselves off as not being able to do things, and we tend to give up. And when you give up, you really give up a lot, and you really start to decline very quickly because of that in itself.
Mm. Yeah, well, you certainly have found meaningful work in your advocacy. And I know we were talking earlier before this chat, and you've really, immersed yourself in getting others with Alzheimer's to raise their voices, encouraging people to get into clinical trials, and to really bring some awareness to this disease and fighting it. So it seems like you definitely have found that meaningful thing that you're passionate about. And so that's all, in addition to all those other things that you're doing, which are good for your physical health, and that engagement or meaningful work and that mental engagement, I'm sure, is also contributing. So thank you for sharing that. And somebody did write in, you mentioned that you're taking some medications for Alzheimer's or specific drugs. They were wondering, and if you don't want to share this personal information, feel free to stop me, but they're wondering if you take Namenda or Aricept. Would you be willing to answer that question?
I originally started taking Aricept, but I had a lot of symptoms and side effects from that that lasted, believe it or not, a whole year because I actually thought my body would eventually get used to it. But after a year, I finally gave up on it because it was getting to be ridiculous. I was feeling nauseous and sick every morning from like around 7:30 till about, I'd say 11:30 every day. Since that time, I've been switched to Namenda and Razidine. And while my wife believes it is helping, she doesn't believe it was as good as the Aricept.
Okay. Well, that's good information. So, Beth, thank you for asking that question. Hopefully, Michael's answer was helpful. Well, you mentioned, the different things that you're doing. You want to keep active and mentally stimulated, and you want to stay engaged in hopes of, I'm guessing, to maintain your independence for as long as possible. So we had a question from Marie. I know that a lot of people talk about driving is very important to their feeling of remaining independent. And so she said, how long is it safe to drive with early onset Alzheimer's? Are you still driving, Michael? So would you mind talking a little bit about driving and your experience? Have you stopped driving? Have you had conversations about that with your family?
Sure, but before I answer that, I just want to go back a little bit. I thought about something else in reference to the drugs. I think it's important for people to understand that the drugs for Alzheimer's that are out there today only work for, I'd say, about 50% of the people. And when they do work, it only works minimally. So it's important for people, if they try one drug and they're on it for 2 months and they don't see that it's working, they should then try a different drug. And sometimes it takes a combination of two. So I think it's important for people not to give up just because they've taken one drug to think that it's not working, that they just need to keep experimenting. Getting back to your driving question, I will tell you that was a very touchy subject. Very early on when I was diagnosed, I actually had to go through a driving simulator test at NIH, National Institute of Health. And part of that test, they came back to my wife and recommended that I stop driving. And the reason for that was the doctor could not tell you when I would no longer be capable of driving. So his recommendation was to be on the safe side and stop driving altogether, which in my opinion was totally ridiculous. And I've done a lot of homework on the driving test and simulator test and have found out that those tests are not really conclusive of your driving abilities, but they're more of your cognitive abilities. In fact, in Europe, they've done some testing on that, and they're now starting to rethink under what conditions people's licenses should be automatically removed or not removed. But I think part of the problem when it comes to driving is everybody is different. And you just can't go by these tests. I think it's very important that the caregiver spends time with the person who's driving and to see if that person's still capable of driving. Plus, of course, how the person may react around the home, because that's going to play a role whether the person's still capable of driving. I will tell you, when I first found out that I shouldn't drive, that really hurt my self-esteem to the point that I was starting to question my own driving capabilities. And it wasn't until I decided that I was going to drive all the way to Florida, down to the Keys, from Pennsylvania, just so I could see how I could drive. And that was probably the best thing I could have done, because it not only built my self-esteem back up, but I came back driving great and having all the confidence in the world. My wife agrees that I'm still driving very good. And, for a while there, we were concerned about the possibility of would I be held liable if I was in an accident? There's a real myth out there. People tend to think that your insurance won't cover you. Well, that's not true. We checked with the insurance, and the insurance company will cover you as long as you weren't already in an accident because you have Alzheimer's and you weren't told not to drive. So the bottom line is, when we checked with the insurance companies, they said that's what insurance is for. So it's very important for people to realize that. Now, it's also important that the person who's doing the driving is not left on their own all the time. And if they are, you want to be able to look for little nicks and things like that on the car, because if you start seeing those, you start to wonder where are they coming from. But again, I would not recommend that, and I would recommend that at least once a month you're driving with that person to see how they're doing, because you never know. Some people can suddenly change very quickly with this disease, especially if they get like a UTI infection or something like that. Things can change very quickly overnight.
Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your experience. And it's good to know that, that your insurance provider was open to you still driving. And it's also a good reminder, to those that maybe have recently got a diagnosis to, continually check in with the driving, from month to month. And, have you, when it comes to driving, are there certain situations, do you drive all the time, or are you limiting your driving as you're seeing changes in your cognition, or have you not seen many?
I try to limit certain type driving. If I can, I will not drive at night. I try to limit myself in the rain if at all possible. There's times that I'll drive slower than I usually do. I'm one of those people who have a lead foot, and for me, doing 85, 90 miles an hour used to be normal. So when I tell people I drive slower now, well, that puts me a little bit around 60, but I still drive fast at times, but it all depends on how I'm feeling. If I'm not feeling very comfortable, I will have a lot more distance between myself and the car in front of me. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, being more careful and just allowing for more time. It took a little used to for my wife to recognize that, because she thought there was something wrong. But hey, look, if I don't feel comfortable at the time of being real close to somebody and riding on somebody's tail, and I'd rather be further back, I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Absolutely. We probably all could slow down a little and leave an extra room in front of us in the car. So, well, that's great that you're still able to drive, and that you and your family have had these discussions. That's one of the questions that we get asked a lot on these live chats is, when do you, how do you initiate the discussion around driving? When do you take the keys away? That sort of thing. So it sounds like, as you mentioned, it's very individualized. The disease affects everyone differently. And so it's something that families should check in with regularly as they see changes in their loved ones. So thank you for sharing your experience on that.
Absolutely. And one thing I should add is, not everyone who's living with this disease recognizes they have a problem. And that's very important to remember, because, there's one person that who I knew who had this disease. He thought he was doing great driving and everything, but in reality, he wasn't. And he just did not recognize that. So it really requires more than one person to be following the person who's doing the driving.
That is a good point to consider. Yeah, those that aren't recognizing that it's an issue. So thank you so much for adding that in at the last minute. That was good. I'm going to ask you another question in a moment, but I just wanted to remind our audience that if you have a question for Michael, please feel free to type it into the questions box there on your screen. We've gotten some great questions so far. It sparked some really good conversation, but want to encourage you at any time, just feel free to chat in your question. So our next question, Michael, is from a woman named Tammy, and she kind of has a description of her situation, and then I'll ask you the question at the end. So she says that her husband was diagnosed 2 years ago with early onset, and he was 60 years old, and he doesn't think anything is wrong. It's better not to discuss it with him, as it just confuses him, and sometimes it causes an argument. She says, I have to let all of our friends and family know. I told our friends privately instead of in front of him, as he doesn't realize he has the disease. Everyone is appreciative to know because it helps them be understanding of his limitations. It eliminates any awkwardness of them not knowing. Everyone is very understanding and caring, and they treat Greg as if nothing is wrong, and I love them for that. So her question was, how do you feel about the people around you understanding your limitations? Is there anything you wish they did differently?
Well, I think everybody is different when it comes to this disease. Some people will recognize they have it, some people will not. Some people will recognize their limitations, and some will not. I can tell you, for me, one of the biggest problems that I deal with is recognizing that a lot of the things I do, I'm doing them incorrectly. And that becomes extremely, extremely frustrating to live with that on a daily basis, to know that you're doing things incorrectly and you can see them. Sometimes I wonder, would I have been better off being one of those people who doesn't know that they have a problem? That could be a good thing. Again, without being on the other side, you don't know. But because of that, it makes it very hard also for people who are around you trying to figure out how they should help you. Because the one thing I've learned about this disease, one day I could be good, another day I might be bad. And it's almost impossible for the person who's working with me to know what I'm like at that moment. Mm-hmm. So where they might want to help me one day, they may not need to help me another day. And it's really very hard for them to know that. So I think that's part of the difficulties with having this disease. You change constantly. And because of that, there's no good answer for that. You have to try to become a detective. And you have to be really good at reading your partner and not try to help out with everything that they're trying to do because they're running slow. I mean, all because somebody's trying to do something, and if they're running slow or not running at the same processing speed you're at, doesn't necessarily mean they don't know how to do it. So you have to give them a chance to try to do it, and don't just jump right in all the time. Because again, if you try to help them too frequently, then they're going to lose that capability of doing the things themselves. So you don't want to try to do too much for them, but you also don't want them to struggle and get frustrated because they're unable to do things. So it's a happy medium there that you have to try to figure it out. And it's not easy, I will tell you that. It is definitely not easy for either party to know when the other should be helping out. I wish I could say there's an easy solution to this. I've seen all kind of people who are living with this disease. And as I said, you know one person with dementia, you only know one. And we are all so different in many aspects when it comes to this. And some of us like help. Some of us do not like the help. I think it really becomes a real issue. But I think it comes down to having dialogue. You have to have dialogue with the person that you're trying to help and try to get a better feel from that person what they would like.
That's all good insight to have, I think, from the family caregiver perspective. And as you mentioned, when you've seen one person with this disease, you've seen one, and it affects everyone differently. And everyone has their good days, their bad days. So I like how you said it. The family almost has to become a detective of sorts to try to figure out, when to step in and help, when to hang back and let them try to figure it out. So I like the way that you put that. And you talked about, or you kind of mentioned, or at least it sounded like to me that you've had an opportunity throughout the years to talk with others living with the disease. And we have a question that kind of relates to that. Dorothy was asking, where do you and your family turn for support? I'll repeat that question in a minute, but I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Dorothy and her situation. So she is 59, and her mom is her 61-year-old husband was diagnosed last year and has declined rapidly. And there's no one her age in her area to lean on. She goes to an Alzheimer's caregiver support meeting and listens closely to the older ladies so that she can learn, but she knows that her road is likely to be much longer and that what she's going through is different than those other caregivers who are older caring for someone that's older that has the disease. So where do you and your family turn for support for early onset Alzheimer's?
Well, to be very honest with you, for me and my wife, support groups probably didn't really work for us. I originally went to support groups thinking it was going to help my wife. And I also did it because I was trying to help the support groups because they needed people. But I get all I need from my advocacy, and because my wife's a medical person, and because she also does a lot of research on her own, and she's been very involved in a lot of the things that I do. She's got to learn a lot about this disease, probably more than most caregivers. So from that respect, we really don't need it. However, there's a lot of people out there that really need it. And, I think the Alzheimer's Association and other places have support groups that you can go to. And there's support groups that are also online that you can do it from your home, which I think is beneficial to talk to other people. I do know that one of the problems that a lot of people tend to run into is finding younger people in these support groups, because most of them tend to be on the older side. And again, that could be very challenging, and it's very different because we tend to go through different scenarios because of our age differences. So I do think it's important to try to find more people at your, within your age. But again, I do know that tends to be difficult. The other thing I would recommend is sometimes if you happen to live near universities tend to also have support groups and some type of support for people. So that might be another place people can check into.
Those are some really, really good suggestions. And I know before we started recording this webinar, we were talking about some of the unique challenges that someone with younger onset faces versus somebody who's diagnosed in their later years. Would you mind talking a little bit about that? So as a younger onset individual living with younger onset Alzheimer's, what kind of different challenges have you encountered versus somebody that maybe got diagnosed after they were retired or in their 70s, 80s, 90s?
Well, the first one is the stigma. Everybody expects to see somebody who's 70 years old, with Alzheimer's. And not only that, they also expect that person to be in some chair with their head back, incapable of doing things. And that's probably the biggest factor that people need to understand, is that younger people also get it. There's probably 400,000 in the U.S. That are living with it today. And they also indicate that probably 50% of the people don't even have a diagnosis. So the numbers are probably a lot higher than that. But when it comes to how we're different, I can tell you, I did not reach my peak in my salary and in my field. I was just getting to that point. I was just getting to a point that I was going to be paying off my mortgage, and to get over that hump that, most people tend to, as the older generation, they tend to retire, and they're by that time getting their pension, or they're getting their Social Security. In my case, I didn't have that. And in fact, in my particular situation, I was fired from my job. And that created another whole problem. I used to have all this insurance and life insurance and all kind of things, but they were all through my work. So the minute I lost my job, I also lost all those things. And because of that, I could no longer get any kind of insurance, because who wants to give you insurance when you have Alzheimer's? So you're kind of suddenly caught that you have a lot of issues that most people don't run into. Besides that, a lot of people tend to have their kids just going into college, or maybe just getting ready to graduate high school, so they got to pay for that college. So there's a lot of expenses that we end up having that, again, the older generation doesn't need to deal with. A big problem is, in our case, my wife, luckily, she happens to have a good job, and she's the breadwinner now. But if it wasn't for her and she didn't have a good job, we would probably be losing our home today. We were one of the fortunate ones. So there's a lot of different issues that happen, unfortunately, when you have this disease and you're young. And I've seen horror stories. I've seen, people who are losing their homes. They didn't even have insurance. And, when you hear those stories, it makes mine look very good, as far as having the disease. So it's always good to think about what others are living with before you start judging how bad your situation may be.
That's good. Again, good insight to have. And earlier you mentioned, a lot of what you attribute to kind of your longer span of living with the disease is attitude. And you seem to have a positive attitude when it comes to living with the disease, and have a good outlook on your situation. It does seem like, your family's so supportive, and it sounds like you have a strong support system. So you are fortunate. So it seems like you, again, have that good attitude, which is contributing to what seems like a lot of the aspects that make you, again, a great advocate for this disease and this cause. I know we've talked a little bit about how you mentioned your daughter, and you had told your daughter about this disease. We had a question, or your diagnosis with the disease. We had a question from Darlene. Her husband has early onset dementia, and she's wondering if there's any tests out there for her children to see if they have a predisposition to developing dementia. And I wanted to ask, are you aware of any of that type of testing? Is your daughter interested, if you're willing to talk about that? I know that not every form of dementia or Alzheimer's is, I'm drawing on a blank, can be passed down through your family. But have you and your family looked into any, genetic testing?
Before I answer that question, I'd like to just touch on attitude, because I think that's very important. I have to tell you, I read a book when I was still working. It was called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And because of that book, that's how I used to run my business at work. I realized very early on that you can't worry about things you cannot change. And that's a very important thing to learn, because that helps with this progression of this disease. If you focus on the negativity of this disease and what you cannot do, and that you think you're going to change it, well, it's going to really bring you down quickly, and your attitude is going to be terrible, and everything about this disease will just go the wrong way. So it's extremely important for people to focus on what they still can do, not what they can't do, and that's how they have to run their life with this disease, because you're not going to change it. There's just nothing you can do to change it. And the sooner people accept that, the better off they're going to be. And that not only goes for the person who's living with it, but also the caregiver. So now to get back to your question, there's only about 2% of the population who has dementia that actually has the genetic type. And I personally don't believe at this point in time it is worth getting genetic testing, because getting genetic testing doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to end up definitely getting this disease. Even if you have the genetic type, your chances are probably like 60% that you're going to get it. So you could end up having the test, and you're going to worry the rest of your life, and you may never get it. So I think it's really important for people to think about that before they do that, because some people, it just may ruin their lives just knowing that, and they're going to worry about something that may never happen. In my particular instance, I did get genetic testing, and out of all the different tests, and I think at the time when I had my genetic testing, there was about 23 different types of genes that they were looking for. I did not fit any of those. So what that means, I don't know. I'm sure there's a lot of genes that they're not aware of yet that they're still going to be identifying in the future. But what I had did not match anything. So what does that mean? Again, the scientists don't know. And, at this point in time, we're still in the early stages to learn those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. That is, you brought up a good point for families to consider, with the percentage of people with the genetic predisposition, it's so small. So families really need to consider, is it worth having that testing done? Will it cause a lifetime of worry? That's a good way to frame it. I bet it would help a family really process through if that's something that they want to, further pursue. So thank you for answering that question. We did have one come in from Jan. She has asked, did Michael try to file for disability prior to being let go from his job? Because she's asking, do they treat dementia as a disability like a typical, physical type of disability that most people are familiar with?
I did file for disability insurance, and I did get it. It was not very easy for me to get that. I actually ended up having to hire a lawyer in order to get that. They supposedly have changed it and made it easier for people with dementia to get it. I think it's called the Compassionate Act or something like that. I don't remember exactly the name. But there is something that's been put in place for people with dementia to be able to file quicker and go through the process. I've heard mixed feelings on that. I've heard some people who got through quickly, and then I heard some people who had a hard story just like I did trying to get Social Security. So I think it all depends on where you're located, what part of the country, and sadly to say, I think part of the reasons is there's a lot of people out there who are trying to beat the system, who are taking advantage of it, and because of that, we tend to end up getting penalized.
Thank you for sharing that. So it sounds like it kind of depends maybe on where you live or your state regulations. So that's something that people really would have to look into kind of on an individual basis. So thank you, Jan, for that question. And I think we have time for about one more question, Michael. And I'm going to move to the resources slide here as we talk about this, just so people can see all of the wonderful resources that Michael, you provided us with some. And then we have some from the Home Instead website, the Help for Alzheimer's website. But I just wanted to kind of close with a discussion about clinical trials. I know that when we first met a couple months ago, Michael, we had a robust discussion about clinical trials at our meeting. And can you tell us, are you engaged in clinical trials? And what type of trials are you engaged in?
Well, I was in a number of trials, clinical trials. In fact, I was in one up until, I guess, a couple months ago, which was the Merck one, which they finally stopped. But clinical trials, I think, is very important for people who are living with this disease and also the families and their friends, because we tend to think about clinical trials that it may not be something helpful for a person like me. And that may be true. But I think it's important for people such as ourselves to get involved in these clinical trials, because if people such as myself don't get in clinical trials, then we will never get a cure for it. And they need people like us to be involved. And those cures, or the delays that they end up finally coming up with, will eventually help a family member in your family or a friend. So I think it's very important that we just not think about the person who's living with the disease, but the whole family probability of possibly getting dementia in the future. So I personally think it's extremely important to get in these clinical trials. You know, another thing I hear a lot is that, well, there's a lot of failures with these clinical trials. Well, I wouldn't look at them as failures, because every time we have one of these clinical trials end and it wasn't successful, they learned a lot. And by learning a lot from that clinical trial, they're able to go into the next clinical trial with a lot more information and with a lot more ideas on what the possible targets may be at that point. So all these things are helping. And I think that's the way people need to start thinking about them, rather than that they're failures. You know, most of these trials with drugs take time. Drug trials with people with dementia take a lot longer time, just because with dementia, it takes years to be able to see that progression. So they really have to follow people a long time. So this disease is much different than most diseases. So just from that aspect alone, it makes it extremely difficult to get a lot of people to do that. I mean, you know, that's important for people to keep that in mind. Now, right now, I'm not in a clinical trial, but I just signed up for one. I think it's called the RAMP study. And actually, up till now, all the trials that I've been in, I didn't do it for my benefit at all. I never expected anything. This particular clinical trial that I'm getting into is actually being performed by Eli Lilly, and it's going to be providing an amyloid PET scan, which is something I've been trying to get for years and years. And that I'm doing because I want to really know, do I have definitely Alzheimer's, or could it be some other type of dementia? So unfortunately, getting that paid through insurance doesn't get covered. So getting in a clinical trial helps me be able to get that, which is a really good thing, because that's probably about a $5,000–6,000 test. And it's something I really wanted to know. But usually when I get in these tests, I just go in there because I'm trying to help out, and I know that what I'm doing is going to hopefully make it good for somebody one day that they're not going to get the answers that I got, that there was no hope. I want that next person to have hope.
Yes, I agree. I think that each clinical trial brings us a little closer to the next big breakthrough when it comes to Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And so I think it's very admirable that you are engaging in clinical trials. And I know that people sometimes want to engage in clinical trials, but don't necessarily know how to go about it. Do you have any suggestions for those listening on how they might get involved in clinical trials? And, is it just limited to people living with the disease, or are there more opportunities beyond just the person with the disease? Maybe they're caregivers or someone that's perfectly healthy.
That's a very good question. First of all, anybody can get in clinical trials, and it's encouraged nowadays that caregivers and younger people start getting in them, because they're trying to hopefully identify possible people who may possibly get Alzheimer's in the future, and they're looking for those people to get into the studies, and they're looking for people who are normal, who will never get it, and people who are. So it's important for those folks to get involved. And you just can't think of the people who have the disease. Now, other people that are really critical to this clinical trials are people who have it in their family multiple generations. Those are also key people. I think it's the DASNY or something like that study where it takes multiple family members to have had Alzheimer's or some form of dementia, and they get into the study because they feel that you're a good candidate to watch, and the chances of you getting the disease is much higher, just like that Colombian family that they have. To me, I think they're going to be a fabulous opportunity for all of us with dementia, because I think that's where they're going to be able to find probably the first possibility of identifying a cure. Now, as far as where you can go for the clinical trials, I've used all the different sites. You have the government website that you can go to. I've used the Alzheimer's website to go to for clinical trials, and there's a couple other little places you go to. But the best one that I found is a place called Antidote. And I found that one to be the easiest one, and it probably gave me the most choices of places to go to. And it also had better coordination to my specific type of dementia and how far it was from my house. So I found that one to be probably one of the easier ones to use as far as tools. Now, that one's fairly new, I think, for dementia, but it's also used for many other types of diseases. But it's very helpful, and I'm really thankful that that one's actually out there now.
Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing that. And we actually do have the Antidote website up there on the Alzheimer's resource slide. I just wanted to quick run through all of those resources for you before I close this out. We have the helpforalzheimersfamily.com site. That's where you can keep up to date on all of our upcoming live chats. We have our Facebook page that you can like and follow, the Missing Senior Network. If your loved one is prone to possibly wandering as a result of their diagnosis with Alzheimer's or dementia, that's a great resource. Homeandsaid.com, Alzheimer's Association's website, alz.org. Again, that clinical trial site, antidote.me, if you want to get engaged in clinical trials, see what's out there that you might qualify for. If you want to learn more about Michael and his movement, you can go to michaelellenbogenmovement.com. He also has his book, and the title is there again, if you want to pick up a copy and, again, read more about his experience living with Alzheimer's disease. And then also Michael's very engaged, we didn't even get to this topic, but Dementia Friendly America. So we have dfamerica.org as a resource up there. If your community hasn't already engaged in Dementia Friendly America, you can go to that site to find more information. And then next month, please join us for our August live chat. On August 9th, we're going to be talking about music therapy for dementias, and we have a wonderful expert, Rachel Norman, will be joining us for that. So we're looking forward to that. But Michael, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much for joining us today, for spending your time with us, our listeners, all of our following, to share your experience and to give people kind of an inside or a different perspective on living with Alzheimer's disease. And hopefully, I know I've learned a lot walking away from this, and I'm hoping that others did as well. So thank you so much, Michael, for being on this live chat and for spending time with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me. And I only have one thing for your caregivers to walk away with is they need patience.
Yeah, yes, patience. That's a great last word of advice to leave us with. So with that, I want to again thank everyone for being with us today for the July live chat. We hope to have you with us next month for August topic, and I wish you all patience. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.